When you first start playing Yu-Gi-Oh, there's lots of things you learn to play around as you naturally progress through the game, and run into a whole bunch of common cards that might alter how you play the game. So in this video, we're going over a lot of gameplay tips that you should definitely keep in mind when playing against any kind of competent deck that might be running some really good staple cards. First up, you should definitely be aware of the prevalence of hand traps. The modern metagame is kind of balanced around these cards that you activate in your hand during your opponent's turn in order to try and disrupt their plays. Being aware of this is probably one of the best tips you can give someone who's new, because otherwise you'll just lose against an unbeatable combo deck and wonder how it's possible to even play the game, and assume Yu-Gi-Oh is all about just waiting for your opponent to spend 5 minutes doing their turn. When actually, there are things you can do about it with pretty much any deck you're playing. One of them is to stop these plays from happening in the first place with some well-timed hand traps, like Ash Blossom and Joy Spring to stop a key search, or dropping Nibiru after their 5th summon to wipe the field. Alternatively, if you're not playing hand traps, you could play a whole bunch of equalizer cards, or also commonly known as going second cards. Cards that are so powerful that they allow you to play through pretty much anything your opponent might put up. If your opponent has a whole bunch of monsters that can negate everything you might do, you can turn them all off with Dark Ruler No More or Forbidden Droplet, or even get rid of all of them with the Winged Dragon of Raw Sphere mode. So, learning which hand traps you can add to your deck, or which going second cards you can add to your deck if you don't want to play hand traps, or a combination of the two, should be thought of first when trying to build your deck. A lot of Yu-Gi-Oh is fought in the deck building process before the duel even begins, and if you play none of these cards, then you're putting yourself at a huge disadvantage. Number 2, try to only play a 40 card deck, and try to play 3 copies of every card. One of the best ways to build a deck is just to put 3 copies of all your best cards into your deck until you have 40 of them, or put maximum copies of all of your combo pieces in, and then play 3 copies of everything else that allows you to search those pieces out until you hit 40 cards. The reason you want to play 40 cards is because that's the minimum amount of cards you can play in your deck, and the less cards you have to draw through, the faster you get to your actual combo pieces. In fact, some people play cards to have a pseudo smaller deck, like Upstart Goblin, which straight up allows you to play a smaller deck, since the card trades 1-for-1 evenly in a generic card draw. So having 3 copies of Upstart Goblin is like having a 37 card deck. Now, there are exceptions to these 2 rules, quite a bit of them. Sometimes you need to go a little bit over 40 cards for certain strategies, but those are pretty rare. In most cases, there's always a card or 2 you can cut out in order to go down to 40. And there's definitely some cards that you don't want to play 3 copies of, like Garnets, for example. There are certain cards in your deck that you'd never want to draw in your opening hand, and you need them in your deck in order to resolve cards, like Gemini Garnet with the Brilliant Fusion. Usually you only play 1 copies of Garnets because you don't actually want to increase your chances of drawing them in your opening hand, because they're literally useless in your hand. And there's also some other cards which are searched out so heavily in your deck that you don't really need to play more than 1 copy too. Generally it depends deck by deck, but the basics is, if it's your best card, you kinda want to play as many copies of it as you can so that you can have 1 of them in your opening hand. Number 3, summoning your monsters in defense position. 2 of the best going second cards in the game are Lightning Storm and Forbidden Droplet, both of which are only really useful against attack position monsters to an extent. So if you're bringing out a super strong monster that you're trying to use in order to scare your opponent during their turn, you can avoid some very powerful going second cards by simply placing it in defense position. Lightning Storm only destroys attack position monsters, and Forbidden Droplet only cuts the attack of the monster in half and leaves their defense alone. This is obviously not viable for every boss monster or even useful information for every deck, since there are some decks where the boss monster literally has 0 defense. But if you're wondering why your meta deck playing opponent is putting their super strong boss monsters into defense position, it's to play around these cards. Number 4, which zones to place your monsters in. If you want to make sure your monster is completely safe from link monsters that have special effects determined by zone placement, putting your most important monster in your rightmost zone saves it from pretty much all of these effects. Monsters in the middle and leftmost zones can be stolen with Geonator Transverser, and monsters in the middle left and middle right zones, right below the extra monster zone, can be stolen with Relinquished Anima or Bounce with Akashic Magician, and monsters in the extra monster zone can be stolen with Gizmek Kaku, the Supreme Shining Sky Stag, and Chimera Tech Megafleet Dragon. So literally the only zone that is safe is the rightmost one on your side of the field. Number 5, old school tip, set all of your spell and trap cards during the main phase 2. If it's your first turn and you have a whole bunch of spell and traps that you need to set in order to activate during your opponent's turn, the best time to use them is after you've already attacked and during the main phase 2. The reason for this is there are some cards that trigger during the battle phase which will get rid of your entire field, or have a chance to pop spells or traps. Most of those aren't played as often nowadays, but we do still have cards like Evenly Matched, which might get rid of your entire field, which would have been safe if you had just left those cards in your hand and waited until after the battle phase to set them. In the past, players had to worry about cards like Malevolent Catastrophe, which would destroy all spell and trap cards on the field when a monster declared an attack, but no one really plays that card anymore. Number 6. Playing around common hand traps. If you have a card that you really need to search with, usually it's better to start off with something less important first. That way you can see if your opponent tries to negate that, and then use your more important card afterwards uninterrupted. Say, for example, you have a Pendulum Call, which makes you discard one card in order to search out 2 cards from your deck. It's an even trade of 2 for 2 and is a super powerful search. However, because it has a discard cost attached to it, it's basically the perfect Ash Bait that you definitely want to stop because you would actually gain card advantage for being able to negate that specific search. So what you could do is just use something else that might search in order to try to bait out the Ash Blossom so that you're safe in using Pendulum Call afterwards. Another one is that meta decks will try to have some kind of monster negate in the field before they perform their 5th summon. That way they can avoid the effects of Nibiru the Primal Being from destroying all of their cards. So the basics are just use your less important cards first, and try to have a monster negate on field before you perform your 5th summon. Number 7. Playing around Infinite Impermanence. This is definitely something you should keep in mind when playing against literally every single deck. There is a very common hand trap called Infinite Impermanence, which has 2 effects depending on how it's used. If it's just used from the hand as a hand trap, that's not really something you have to play around, because this is going to negate one monster effect until the end of the turn. However, if Infinite Impermanence is played on the field, it gains a secondary effect, where if it successfully negates the effect of a monster for the turn, it also creates a lingering effect where it negates the effects of all spell or trap cards in the same column as it until the end of the turn. And because of this, you want to set your spell and traps in columns that are not the same column as your opponent's spell and trap cards, just in case one of their set cards is Infinite Impermanence, because they can sometimes get a 2-for-1 off of the negate, and negate one of your monster effects as well as disabling one of your spell and trap card zones for the rest of the turn. And also be wary when your opponent uses Infinite Impermanence, and that you don't activate any spell or trap cards from your hand in the column that Infinite Impermanence activated on the field in, since the effect lasts all turn. Number 8. Understanding the choke point of different decks and combos. Like I explained in the Pendulum Call example, there are some points in certain decks where you can use a hand trap to completely stop all of their plays, and other points where using a hand trap doesn't really slow them down very much. A modern meta deck gets to its meta status because it's able to play through a hand trap or 2. If your deck is completely stopped by any form of disruption, then it's probably not competitive. And because meta decks can play through common hand traps, the best way to deal with them is to know your opponent's deck inside and out, and know exactly what to hit with your hand traps. Like knowing to use Ash Blossom on Pendulum Call, or knowing to use Infinite Impermanence on Gossip Shadow in order to stop its effects so your opponent can't go into Rongominiat. This requires a lot of knowledge on meta decks. It is definitely something that's harder for new players to understand, and just requires a lot of experience. Number 9. Chain Blocking. Cards which have effects that negate have to be activated directly in response to that effect happening. So, you can actually use this ruling to your advantage in order to get around your opponent having the opportunity to negate your card effects. However, the situation in which you can chain block is kind of limited, but here's an example. Say you have 2 monsters on the field, both of them have mandatory effects that activate when they're sent to the graveyard, and your opponent has a Borreload Savage Dragon on the field, so they can negate any one of your card effects. Witch of the Black Forest allows you to search out a monster with 1500 or less defense from your deck, and Sandgate allows you to search out a monster with 1500 or less attack, and you really need Witch of the Black Forest to resolve so that you can search out Dark Armed Dragon in this example. You send both of them to the graveyard at the same time in order to bring out the Link monster Beat Cop from the Underworld, so both of their effects activate at the exact same time. And if you want to make sure that Witch of the Black Forest effect is not negated by your opponent's Borreload Savage Dragon, what you can do is choose to just have her effect chain first, then have Sandgan chain afterwards. And then your opponent gets a chance to respond, where they only have the option to negate Sandgan's effect, unless they have some other way to negate the effect of Witch of the Black Forest in the graveyard, like maybe a Called by the Grave, which ignores chain orders. And there's a lot of archetypes which have situations where they get to choose the chain of their cards, and get around a lot of negates because of inherent chain blocking in their strategies, which is a pretty advanced level technique that most decks don't even have the option of. But it is definitely something to be aware of, just in case a situation does come up where you really need one of your effects to resolve. Number 10. Understanding some of the few keywords in the game. There is a difference between Destroy and Negate, where if you destroy a monster, that doesn't mean its effect is negated. One of the more common mistakes new players make is chaining a Mystical Space Typhoon to a spell or trap card, where one would assume that would stop the effect from happening, but it rarely does. There are some circumstances in which you can use Mystical Space Typhoon to destroy a spell or trap card and stop its effect from happening, but you're not technically negating the effect of the card. For example, if your opponent activates Trickstar Light Stage, which is a field spell card that lets them search out a card from their deck, you can actually destroy this with Mystical Space Typhoon in order to stop the search from happening. But that's only because face-up spell and trap cards require the card to be on the field to resolve their effects. All other spell and trap cards, and even monsters, do not, unless they specifically say so. Which is why some continuous spell and traps will have specific text that says their effect activates even if the card leaves the field. The same applies for monsters. If your opponent summons Elemental Hero Stratos, which has an effect that activates as soon as it's summoned, and you chain the effect to something like Raigeki Break in order to destroy the card, the effect will still go through and resolve, even if the card is no longer on the field. Which means you can actually make sure your effects go off if you remove your card from the field yourself. Like, for example, you summon Dragon Spirit of White, which has an effect that activates immediately on its summon to banish one of your opponent's spell or trap cards. If your opponent then tries to chain a negate to it, like Infinite Impermanence, you can actually avoid that negate by using the second effect of Dragon Spirit of White, which tributes itself in order to special summon a monster from your hand. Since Dragon Spirit of White is no longer on the field, Infinite Impermanence doesn't have a monster's effect to negate, and its effect will still go off. That allows it to banish one of your opponent's spell or trap cards, as well as being able to special summon that Blue Eyes monster from your hand. You can also use the spell card Book of Moon in order to accomplish the same thing, since Infinite Impermanence requires a face-up target to negate, and monsters don't need to be face-up on the field for their effects to resolve. So if you're in a situation where you're summoning Elemental Hero Stratos in order to search out a hero monster from your deck, and your opponent activates Breakthrough Skill in order to negate your Stratos' effect, you can actually chain Raigeki Break in order to destroy your own Stratos. That way the effect resolves and goes through. Alright, and those are some tips and tricks on how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! In the actual gameplay sense of the word. If you have any other kinds of suggestions or advice, or ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.